It was again the emperor who, on that occasion, preserved France from all the disastrous results which would have attended a reverse of fortune. He concluded peace in 1809 because the indifference of the Russians, who had guaranteed to him the repose of the North, clearly indicated that he ought not to rely upon them. He was the more justified in drawing this conclusion when that power showed a repugnance to cement her alliance with him. Was it then unreasonable in him to form a closer connection with Austria, who willingly, even anxiously, offered the Archduchess Maria Louise in marriage? Once united to that power, was it a mad enterprise to attempt in his turn to open a new account with the Russians? It must assuredly be allowed that he could not possibly adopt greater precautions towards securing his eventual success. All Europe, excepting England, was marching under his banners, and in all probability he had delayed another year the formation of that crusade. More than one power would have rejected the proposal of taking part in it. A single winter destroyed everything and hurled back upon the emperor the storm which he had brought upon his enemies. It was beyond his power to foresee this misfortune, but by incredible efforts of genius he recovered his superiority at Lutzen. There again he upheld the edifice, which was perhaps on the point of crumbling to ruins. It is possible that at Prague sufficient efforts were not made to detach Austria from the coalition, but that coalition was in arms and united in one solid mass. It did everything to elude a peace. The Battle of Dresden took place. Unfortunately, that noble feat of arms was followed by a series of reverses which presaged our decline and the downfall of the hero who had hitherto supported us. I will not resume a long recital of those events and shall confine myself to a few recollections. The enemies pretended to wage war against the emperor only. It is true that they entertained a feeling of bitter animosity against him. This was quite natural. Experience had told them that he alone was capable of opposing the execution of the projects they had constantly aimed at since 1792. They endeavored to detach the French from their sovereign, laying out of consideration the differences of opinion which still broke their unanimity, and all the reproaches which they deemed themselves warranted in directing against their sovereign. The French overlooked the circumstance that they had placed the revolution and their own interests at all hazards under his protection, and that by deserting him in the midst of a danger which threatened them no less than himself, they placed him under the necessity of becoming bankrupt to them. This is what actually came to pass. The emperor, once overthrown, all the circumstances attendant upon that event followed as a natural consequence, and whatever complaints the French may attempt to indulge in, it will always be replied to them. Trust the Punic faith. The men who have thus led astray the nation, which retains all its goodness and integrity of character unsullied, are the same who took the lead in all the serious disorders which occurred since 1789 until that disastrous period, and who have on each occasion exhibited themselves in features of still greater depravity. What do they now reply to that very nation who is clamorous in her demands for a restitution of the price of the efforts she had made during a period of 20 years and of the blood which her children have lost in her defense? Will they send her to the king or the princes of the House of Bourbon? But the king cannot be accountable for what he never received. The provisional government of M. de Talleyrand, in making a traffic of the armistice which preceded the king's entry into Paris, has placed the monarch under the impossibility of claiming those rights of conquest which the nation had it in her power to assert. The provisional government has alone accomplished her ruin, and has perhaps scattered over the country the elements of fresh disorders. The French will, in short, be addressed in these words: if the Austrians had abandoned their monarch on the two occasions of your obtaining possession of Vienna, the Austrian monarchy would have been lost. If the Prussians had been faithless to their king after the misfortunes which afflicted their country, their political existence was at an end. If the Russians had likewise abandoned the Emperor Alexander because we were masters of Moscow, that vast monarchy would have been dismembered. Those three nations have patiently borne the infliction of lengthened calamities and have obtained the reward of their perseverance. As to you Frenchmen, you have shut your eyes to the fact that if you were not brought under the yoke 15 years before, the cause was to be found in your having the emperor at your head You will now have an opportunity of satisfying yourselves that if the enemy bear you down with all the weight of their resentment, it is because they no longer fear the prince who protected you, and no obstacle opposes their carrying into effect the decree pronounced against France in 1792. Would it have cost you as much had you afforded him the means of defending you as it has cost you since you have separated from him? Suffer therefore with patience, and beware complaining, but above all things avoid fresh disorders which would accomplish the destruction of the political existence still remaining to you. Recollect that you still reckon 24 millions of men with uniformity of law and of language. This resource wielded by the councils of prudence is yet incalculable. Chapter 13. I shall run rapidly over all that took place in the interval between the king's arrival and the return from the island of Elba. I was no longer placed in a situation that afforded me the means of forming a correct opinion. I shall only relate the precise facts, and prefer falling into omissions rather than narrate any circumstance the truth of which might perhaps be contested. The forfeiture once proclaimed, everyone made up his mind, and the House of Bourbon acquired on its return to France a moral power of opinion which might be compared to the power wielded by the emperor against the Directory on his arrival from Egypt. It needed but very trifling efforts to secure a peaceful reign to the king. If the events which had restored him to the throne had not been turned into a revolution, which usually brings out another, had he come to take his seat in the Tuileries without effecting any other alteration than in his domestic mode of life, there is no doubt that the administration would have proceeded without meeting any obstruction in its course. Many reasons would have contributed to this repose. The management of public affairs was in the hands of men of talents who had long been accustomed to direct them. In the second place, there is generally felt in France a want of a steady government. Everyone is accordingly disposed to obey as soon as the measures adopted are founded in reason, with the exception of the two administrations of the police and of foreign affairs, which should always be entrusted to men possessing the private confidence of the monarch. The king could not adopt a more judicious choice than what had already been made by the emperor. Such an arrangement, however, did not answer the purpose of those intriguers who had grouped round their provisional government. The latter endeavored to keep the king in check and to assume a position sufficiently commanding to enable them to remove all those who might have been disposed to draw the prince's attention to their conduct. These gentlemen had not, in fact, compromised with foreigners and overthrown the emperor for the purpose of remaining in their former obscurity. They had merely sold themselves to the enemy with the view of obtaining the first places in the state. They had no notion of being disappointed. They accordingly neglected no means of persuading that they ought to be suitably provided for. The king was not acquainted with any of them. He could not avoid trusting to those who presented themselves in the character of men who had risked everything to procure his return. He accordingly confirmed, with a few exceptions, the selection made by the provisional government. The consequence was that the majority of the council remained devoted to Monsieur de Talleyrand. This observation is not unimportant, owing to the inferences about to be drawn from it. Talleyrand was Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Abbé de Montesquieu, Minister of the Interior, the Abbé Louis, a friend of Talleyrand since 1789, Minister of Finance, General Dupont, a dependent of Talleyrand, Minister of War, Malouet, who was much attached to the king, but a dupe of Talleyrand, was Minister of the Marine, Monsieur de Vitrolles, Minister, Secretary of State. The police of Paris, as well as of the kingdom, was in the hands of Monsieur Butenot, who was too upright a man not to be the dupe of Monsieur de Talleyrand. At first, only one Director General of Police was appointed, owing to a circumstance which I shall presently explain. The National Guard was confided to General de Soult, and the ex-Imperial Guard to Marshal Oudinot. The Duc d'Alberg and Bournonville were ministers of state. How could the king, thus surrounded, have stirred a step without Monsieur de Talleyrand? Matters accordingly went on indifferently well. For the space of 2 months, the king could not acquire in a shorter time a knowledge of the men with whom he was brought into contact. The chamber of deputies was convoked. A call was made for the chamber, which had been adjourned by the emperor in the preceding month of January. They hastened to meet with minds thirsting for revenge. The return of the Bourbons was supposed to have been brought about and prepared long beforehand, and consequently accompanied with every guarantee to public freedom so ardently expected. All fancied they had reached the happy goal, and were as unsparing of praises to the newcomers as of insults to the emperor. It is impossible to abstain from indulging in gloomy reflections on the national character, or comparing the invectives uttered in the tribune with the adulations which had so often resounded from it. So true it is that conquest alone can keep alive the spirit of enthusiasm, and that the successful issue of a contest constitutes the claim to glory, and not the nature of interests which it is attempted to defend. The more violent were the speeches uttered, the greater freedom was enjoyed by the public press, the more the king felt on the one hand the moral force which he possessed, and on the other the obligation of assuming a different position from what had been created for him by the provisional government. The same consideration made the latter sensible of the necessity of reinforcing his own party, and this circumstance afforded me reasons for anticipating the projects meditated by Monsieur de Talleyrand. It was indispensable for their execution that the foreigners should have previously retired from our territory. He accordingly accelerated this measure, and we were not long in getting rid of them. This object being accomplished, he endeavored to swell the numbers of his partisans, and had recourse to the men commonly denominated Jacobins. They had long ceased to exist as a body, but it was necessary to create them, and the following means were resorted to for the purpose. The report was spread that they existed in considerable strength, and that they already showed signs of agitation. This was brought under the king's notice in order to find an opportunity of mentioning the name of Monsieur Fouché, for whom it was wished to procure the appointment of Minister of Police. The Duc de Tronto was pointed out to him as the only man that France could produce, at all calculated by his talents for properly discharging the duties of that office, as alone capable of keeping the Jacobins in check, who were the more to be dreaded as they carried on an intercourse with the Illuminés of Germany. It was with the view of procuring for them the portfolio of the Ministry of Police that a mere Director General was at first appointed to that department, as the latter could not have felt offended at a cabinet minister being placed over his head. Had Monsieur Fouché been made acceptable to the king, the party of the Jacobins might easily have been reorganized under the semblance of his opposing and keeping them in check. Those demagogues would have been raised to official and elective functions. In this manner would have been laid the foundations of the project which it had been felt necessary to abandon when the allied sovereigns had declared for the Bourbons. The king obstinately refused to accept Monsieur Fouché, and thus unsuspectingly defeated the meditated project. I was told of the following anecdote on this subject by the Duc d'Alberg himself. The king had been already a fortnight in Paris when all those who had received honorary titles from the emperor were admitted to the distinction of being presented. The dukes, amongst others, were invited through the columns of the Moniteur to make their appearance. There was no end to the insults lavished upon me. I was assailed in pamphlets and cried down in the newspapers. All this sufficiently indicated on what footing I stood at the palace, and I took care not to present myself. I waited for a second invitation. It appeared in the Moniteur. I made up my mind accordingly and went to present my respects to the head of the government, meeting the Duc d'Alberg in the saloon of the throne. I entered into conversation with him until mass was over. He asked me what I intended to do. I replied that I had no plan in view and merely desired to live in peace and at a distance from the turmoil of public affairs. I know not where he took up the impression that I was ambitious of serving, but he advised me to renounce all attempts to courting the favors of fortune, adding that I was a worthy man, but wholly capable of filling any first-rate office. The statesman had pronounced and had even acknowledged that there never had been any other skillful man than Monsieur Fouché in the administration of the police department. He informed me that it had been proposed to the king to take him back, but that it was found impossible to conquer the prince's repugnance to employing a man who had voted for his brother's death. Monsieur d'Alberg thought this an extraordinary prejudice, and said that it was a great misfortune for France, as Monsieur Fouché was the only man capable of directing it under existing circumstances, and that sad work would soon take place unless a decided course were adopted against the restless minds which kept France and Germany in a state of agitation. I could not help remarking to him that, entertaining as he did such an opinion, I felt at a loss to account for his having concurred in the destruction of a work which offered so strong a guarantee against the propagation of principles which he appeared to hold in so much dread. He replied that it was found impossible to control the tide of events, and no resource was left but to adopt a course which there existed no means of repelling. We were greatly alarmed one night, he added, and if so much hurry had not been evinced in accepting of these, speaking the princes of the House of Bourbon, it was not likely that we should have again beheld the emperor. Had it not been for Marmont, it is not quite certain that he would have been dethroned. What could we do? We had no time to arrange anything before the return. We are only now on the point of giving our attention to business. But if we do not succeed in instilling into the minds of these princes a determination to reign in harmony with the liberal ideas, the country will be untenable. Everyone will have to effect his escape. Such was the language of Monsieur d'Alberg some 20 days after the king's arrival. This afforded me a clue to the object contemplated in the attempt to place Monsieur Fouché in the Ministry of Police. An endeavor was already made to secure the direction of the post in order to set about the subversion of a government as yet scarcely established. During the 3 first months which followed the return of the Bourbons, the public mind was satisfied. Nevertheless, it had already been discovered that no guarantee was taken against the projects which Louis XVIII might meditate for the future, with the view of bringing matters back to the point at which they existed previously to the Revolution of 1789. The immediate attendants upon the king soon became possessed of the confidence to which they were entitled by the position in which they had lived, in consequence of the misfortunes the prince himself had experienced during a quarter of a century. These attendants chiefly consisted of old men who were no longer acquainted with France. They had retained all the spleen which the events of the Revolution had instilled into their minds, and had learned nothing ever since they had been driven to fly for shelter on foreign soil. The Chamber of Deputies, on the contrary, was composed of men who were scarcely acquainted with what the former were unwilling to forget. I mean the minute observances of the old regime. The deputies loudly professed all the political principles which had been consecrated by the Revolution. It was, therefore, easy to discover that a state of concord could not be of long duration, and that either the old men would have to reform their ways in unlikely circumstance, or that the men reared up in the spirit of the Revolution must retrograde in their notions and abjure all the sentiments they had professed with the tenacity of dogmas, or followed from pure habit for the last 20 years. In the summer of 1814 passed off in this manner. Towards the month of September, directions were afforded of all that yet remained to be done in order to obtain what was so long called for, and that much more would, in all probability, be demanded without any prospect of a right understanding. It must be supposed, notwithstanding the swarm of productions of all kinds, which were published on the subject of constitutions and of governments, no clear suggestions were ever presented to the public mind. Otherwise, it must needs be acknowledged that a great want of sagacity was displayed in overlooking them. We have now been fighting nearly 30 years for a constitution, and by dint of aiming at perfection in the concoction of one, we have ended by having none at all. Whilst discussions were going on respecting the rights of man and individual liberty, we beheld the prescription of citizens entitled to respect on the score of their long service, and the nation enslaved by being deprived of the first of prerogatives, whilst plans of finance were under discussion and the national prosperity engaged the attention of government. We further witnessed the destruction of the public wealth and the submission to all those disastrous arrangements which have placed everything, the territory itself, under mortgage for the fulfillment of engagements entered into with the enemy. A constitution is no doubt a very necessary object But it is equally indispensable to place at the helm of the state men whose intentions are pure and whose conduct is no less honorable. The same men who had attributed to their influence those events which brought about the return of the House of Bourbon were particularly attentive in watching the contrast existing between the sentiments entertained by the attendants about the king's person and those which animated the majority of Frenchmen. Experience has sufficiently demonstrated the eventual issue of internal disunion when the nation is at variance with the governing power. On the present occasion, it was already foreseen that a fresh catastrophe would be the consequence of this state of things, which had nevertheless so recently unfolded itself to our view. But when there exists a misunderstanding upon principles, it equally exists in respect to the consequences to which it necessarily leads. The opinions of all parties silently harmonized with each other. Societies were soon observed to form on all sides, in which the government and every act of its administration were freely censured. From that moment, Mr. de Talleyrand and his colleagues bethought themselves of the task of preparing an order of things which might be substituted to the established one in case they could succeed in effecting its downfall. In the meanwhile, the king appointed his diplomatist as his ambassador at the Congress assembled in Vienna. Mr. de Talleyrand repaired to that capital in the company of the Duke d'Alberg, for whom he procured a diplomatic character. Nevertheless, he adopted the precaution of organizing his correspondence with Paris upon a safe basis in order to acquire correct information of whatever might occur. He procured the temporary appointment to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Monsieur de Jaucourt, his dependent, and afterwards took his departure for Vienna. On quitting Paris, Monsieur de Talleyrand was fully convinced that a fresh revolution was unavoidable. He had accordingly endeavored to find out on which side the majority might be induced to lean. The Duke of Orleans had already been spoken of, but this idea was soon dismissed because that prince did not offer adequate securities against the disadvantages which were found to be insurmountable in respect to the attendance of the princes of the elder branch. In other words, the Duke d'Orleans would not have sufficiently estranged himself from the emigrants and all those who were generally included under that common denomination. As no desire was felt for a republic or an elective government, it was considered that the most rational course of proceeding would be to adhere to a regency. In furtherance of this object, however, it was necessary to adopt some course against the emperor, who might abandon his island and reach Paris with the rapidity of an arrow. The authors of the act of forfeiture had set to work. They had associated in their views all disturbers of the public tranquility and had formed the project of compassing the assassination of the emperor. It occurred to them to connect the public authority with this criminal attempt. The assassin was prepared to strike the blow. It was only necessary to obtain the king's consent. Mr. de Blacas was applied to. He was prevailed on to submit the project to the sovereign, who refused to listen to it. Nevertheless, the political agitators, to whom his sentiments were made known in terms of reprehension, continued to persist in the guilty determination they had formed. Another consideration which determined the adoption of a regency was the circumstance that the armies had returned to France after having successfully evacuated all the points which they still occupied beyond the frontiers. The prisoners of war had returned from England as well as from other countries. They saw all prospects of promotion closed against them, owing to the creation of a company of noblemen appointed for the purpose of guarding the king's person. Some measures of this kind had afforded pretenses to those who were restless and discontented to vent their inward spleen. Matters had proceeded at a rapid rate. Already in the month of October, 10 persons were found disposed to arm against the king for every one who was resolved to defend him. Other considerations purely personal to Monsieur de Talleyrand compelled him also not to lose a moment in endeavoring to alter his position, which he had rightly considered to be of an unfavorable nature and incompatible with the principles which appeared to constitute the chief basis of the king's government. His determination was formed when he quitted Paris, but he was undecided as to the most proper means to be adopted or as to the authority to be substituted to the existing government after its downfall, as he justly foresaw that the majority of the nation and the whole army would be more favorable to a regency than to the Duke of Orleans, who was scarcely better known than the elder branch. He only thought of securing himself against any danger to which he might be exposed by the return of the government which he had himself overthrown. Accordingly, the main object of his attention at Vienna was the abduction of the emperor, whom he represented as a weight upon France and as feeding the hopes of all restless minds. In this respect, he was right. The subject of the emperor engrossed the attention of all parties. The more consideration was bestowed upon the details of the events which had occasioned his downfall, the greater was the interest felt for him. Talleyrand had present to his mind the example of the return from Egypt. He dreaded a second representation of that event. It had so often been asserted that the tranquility of Europe depended upon the repose of France, that it was easy to perceive that the abduction of the emperor was necessary to the general welfare. Monsieur de Talleyrand therefore succeeded in securing the adoption of this course. The emperor of Russia alone showed great difficulty in assenting to the proposal, but he at last tacitly consented to it. It has been asserted that the King of France had given such an instruction to his plenipotentiary. I can only relate what was told me on the subject, but is it to be believed that Monsieur de Talleyrand would have taken upon himself to open such a negotiation if it had not been in accordance with his instructions? It was not, however, an unreasonable wish on the king's part, but it must be allowed, in that case, that he conferred upon the emperor the right of defending himself and of forestalling him, as he actually did. It had never been agreed on that he was not to attack the King of France, still less that he was not to defend himself against the king's aggression. It is unfair to attribute to the emperor only the afflicting results which attended his enterprise. At some time or other, this question will again come under discussion, though such an occurrence will be much to be deplored. The Congress of Vienna had been but a short time open when a change occurred in the administration of Paris by the death of Monsieur Malouet, who was the Minister of Marine. This occurrence deprived Monsieur de Talleyrand of one of his votes. Monsieur Malouet was replaced by Monsieur Bugnol, who has always been a perfect stranger to the Marine Department. On the other hand, the Ministry of Police was assigned to Monsieur d'André, a worthy and independent man who could not be ranked in the class of those who acted under Monsieur de Talleyrand's influence. Finally, the king, having discovered certain malpractices in the expenses of the War Ministry, withdrew the portfolio from General Dupont and conferred it on Marshal Soult, who was thus disposed to place himself under the protection of the diplomatist. The latter thus found himself deprived of much of his power since his departure from Paris, a circumstance which greatly contributed to induce his bringing the second part of his plan to an earlier termination than he had originally intended. The imaginations of weak minds were tortured in Paris by pretended projects of proscription. Lists were purposely circulated upon which were inscribed the names of those who appeared to have been the first victims of the work of reaction. The intrigue was carried so far as to have urged the attendants about the king's person into every species of measure most calculated to render him unpopular. This means was probably resorted to with the view of accelerating his downfall. This state of things could not fail to become the matter of a correspondence between Paris and Vienna, in which Monsieur de Talleyrand was correctly informed of whatever might interest him. Towards the months of November and December, the political horizon around Paris was so deeply obscured, even for those who inhabited the capital, that it was difficult not to form a still worse opinion of it. When the state of affairs was only considered through the medium of an epistolary correspondence. At this period, the royal family were beginning to decline in public opinion. So far from recovering their former footing, they daily lost more ground. A twofold circumstance will account for the change. In the first place, there existed a decided opposition to the political views they were supposed to entertain. The restoration of national property and other objections of the same nature had sufficed to detach the people from their cause. In the second place, there was exercised this period an active agency which allowed no feature to escape that was at all calculated to render the House of Bourbon unpopular. A skillful recourse was had to the arm of ridicule, which in France is so powerful a weapon, and in this crisis it was wielded in every form and shape, and affectation was displayed of despising that dangerous engine, but it inflicted deep wounds. The royal family soon appeared quite isolated in the midst of the French nation. I had formerly been too much engaged in public affairs not to seek for the causes of what was now so palpably apparent and so general, that in the country where I lived in a state of retirement, the country people told me to wait with patience, that the crisis could not last. Nevertheless, it was not until some time afterwards that I ascertained the origin of the symptoms which I had discovered from my place of banishment. I will mention this circumstance just as I received it, but I must first relate an anecdote personal to myself as it comes in support of the opinion which it was attempted to countenance respecting the formation of lists of proscription. I always imagined that the order given to me to quit Paris was to be ascribed to some conspirer of fresh revolutions. However reluctant I felt to obey the order, I was compelled to give way, as I was not in so secure a situation as to warrant my braving the spirit of malice, which was unrelenting in its persecution of me. It was besides so easy a matter for the intriguers and new plots to ascribe their words and deeds to a man who had been minister of the police that I was bound to act with circumspection. Matters had come to such a pass that my most trifling movements gave rise to suspicions. The following fact will attest the truth of my assertion. I had given myself up to agricultural pursuits. The potato crop had failed, and I was compelled to order the purchase of 200 or 300 sacks of that root at the different markets in the neighborhood of Paris, from whence, after having been stored in one of the coach houses of my hotel, they were brought to my estate at the distance of 10 leagues from the capital. Would it be believed that so trivial a circumstance should have become a state matter, and that someone had the boldness to address charges against me to princes of the blood for having hoarded up provisions and meditated the design of starving the city of Paris? An order was given to the commissary of the district to certify the existence and quantity of those potatoes, and to receive my declaration as to the use I intended to make of them. That ridiculous visit was carried on with the utmost rigidity. I am bound to acknowledge that the agents of police were ashamed of their task, but they were compelled to obey. Being forced to quit Paris, I retired to my estate, where I resided alone, my wife and children having remained in possession of my hotel. We had reached the month of November. A man decorated with honors presented himself at my residence and requested to speak with me. I admitted him. He stated that he was under obligations to me, and gratitude made it a law for him to communicate a plot which was hatching against me. Do not remain here, Monsieur le Duc, he said. Do not remain here. I cannot sufficiently recommend your returning to Paris, which you have not been made to quit without a motive. You were to have been called upon the day before yesterday. The visit did not take place, but it is only delayed. In a few days, your house will be entered by 14 persons under the guise of D, who must be known to you. The others are men of the same stamp. He named them all. They will come to demand your money. This will be the pretense assumed for the purpose of originating a quarrel in which you are to be assassinated. They are assured of impunity. The report of the expected adventure has already been drawn up for insertion in the newspapers. It is worded in such a manner as to lead to the inference that you had been visited with a view to obtain money from you and to propose a challenge which you were to refuse, but compelled by the men of honorable character with whom you were brought into contact, you had been under the necessity of accepting it. And as the story was invented of your wounding someone in your defense, it was further reported that in the course of this dueling, you had wounded a first then a second person. All those, in short, who were to pretend their having received wounds, but that you had at last fallen in your turn. I can tell you no more without endangering my own safety, but let no consideration keep you at home, for I could not call a second time to put you on your guard. This worthy man withdrew, and, as may well be supposed, I sent to the Minister of Police a copy of his declaration, acquainted him at the same time with the names indicated to me. The parties could easily be found out, since this blank was a knight of St. Louis and doorkeeper to the king's apartments. I caused a communication to be made of his project to his captain, Mr. de Mortemar, and heard no more of the matter. Notwithstanding this precaution, I deemed it prudent to return to Paris and to remain there for some days in order that the plan of assassinating me at my country house might be relinquished. It was during this short stay in the capital that I discovered indications of the impending revolution. Its ramifications, however, were only known to me after the return from Elba. I shall record them in this place. Chapter 20. Being informed of what was taking place in Paris, and entertaining no doubt that the emperor would be carried off from the island of Elba, Monsieur de Talleyrand was wholly bent on accelerating this operation, which was said at the same time to have been entrusted to the English admiral, Sir Sidney Smith, whose ostensible mission was to be the command of an expedition against the Barbary States and the Mediterranean. I only learned this circumstance from what was publicly reported in Paris, where a variety of letters received from London communicated details respecting the Congress, towards which all eyes were then turned. The English newspapers also reported that the emperor was to be removed to St. Helena, and the report was repeated in the German papers, which the emperor regularly received at Elba. No doubt was entertained that this operation would be carried into effect. How was it possible, besides, to refuse credit to the assertion when the following circumstances are considered, which were communicated to me by M. Fouché himself in the month of May, 1815. We must call to mind that M. de Talleyrand had the Duke d'Alberg in his train. The latter was married to the daughter of Madame de Brignon, who had accompanied the Empress Maria Louisa to Vienna. M. de Talleyrand had thus a natural means of negotiating his personal position with the regent. After describing the instructions from the King of France, the act of causing the emperor to be carried off to St. Helena, a course, however, which was at least as useful to his own views as it could be to the king's interests. Whilst engaged in an official negotiation on this point, he made use of the Duke d'Alberg for the purpose of circulating amongst the foreign ministers the report that there would soon be a necessity in France of breaking off from the House of Bourbon, who could not succeed in winning over to their cause any of the parties into which the nation was divided. He had it insinuated that it was an act of prudence on his part to foresee such an emergency and be in readiness to substitute any other order of things to the existing one, unless it were wished that the country should be again thrown into convulsion. Having presented this emergency as a result of an anticipated foresight of what might come to pass, he was quite sure of being listened to and of exciting a sufficient degree of attention to create an inquiry into the truth of his assertion, which could not fail to be borne out by all the facts conveyed through the medium of the correspondence from Paris. Fouché told me that the Duke d'Alberg wrote to him at that period with the view of obtaining from himself certain data on the subject, no doubt intending to turn it in Vienna to his own account. But as Fouché knew the correspondent he had to deal with, he replied that he would not interfere in anything until he should have received a letter from the Austrian minister. He added that at this period, and in all probability upon the representations of M. d'Alberg, M. de Metternich, intending no doubt to judge of the degree of confidence to be given to the language held at Vienna by the mere deputy of a diplomatist addressed in a letter to him, and that he had sent a reply to it. He further said that this first letter of M. de Metternich was followed by 4 more letters. Feeling thus assured of the intentions of Austria, he set himself to work. Until that moment, however, according to his own assertion, he had repelled every entreaty made to him. I preserve, added Fouché, all those letters of M. de Metternich to be made use of in proper time. They are 5 in number. He must have as many from myself. One of them was written for the purpose of consulting me on a question which he had laid down under the 3 following heads. in case the emperor should reappear in France. What might be the result of such an event? Should the King of Rome be brought to the frontier and supported by a corps of Austrian troops? What might this lead to? And in short, if neither occurrence should take place, and if the movement springing from the population should assume a national character, what direction would it take? Mr. Fouché told me that he replied to each question in the following manner. If the emperor reappeared on the frontier, all would depend on the conduct of the first regiment sent against him. Should it go over to his side, the whole army would follow its example. If the King of Rome presented himself at the frontier under the protection of an Austrian corps, all parties would instantly join him. If neither of these occurrences took place and the revolutionary movement proceeded from the interior, it would be effected on behalf of the Duc d'Orléans. He set himself to work. In consequence of these communications, Fouché and Dalberg are both afflicted with the mania of fancying that they possess the gift of persuasion. They are unwilling to perceive that they are seen through, and that on this occasion, more than on any other, it was found that they only aimed at another convulsion because their personal hopes had been frustrated in consequence of the principles adopted by the princes of the House of Bourbon. They desired nothing more than the first places in the state and were quite indifferent to the national honor. Such, however, was not the calculation made by the foreigners. It mattered little to them whether M. Fouché and Dalberg had the first or last places. All they wished was to take advantage of the underhand plots which those two men had it in their power to hatch. I know not if they were deceived in this case. I am neither justified in doubting or believing it. Certain, however, am I that they were both too well known to have it in their power to dupe anyone. They thought otherwise, for it is the peculiar characteristic of vanity to be blind to self-defects. Nevertheless, Mr. Fouché could not fail to perceive that the House of Bourbon was daily losing ground in Paris, and that a revolution was the more probable as it was not obstructed by any difficulties. He had had communications with Vienna and only dreamed of taking advantage of a first convulsion to create a personal position productive of greater advantages to himself. He accordingly began by sounding the opinions of some young generals amongst those who had been retained on full service and were in command of troops. He took care to select the officers who were most susceptible of enthusiastic feelings, to portray the misfortunes which oppressed the country, and point out to them that such gallant men as they would never be treated with proper consideration by a government surrounded by none but the old nobility, that in short they might expect to be soon discharged from active service. Mr. Fouché was not sufficiently known by those to whom he held this language to enable them to form a correct judgment of his projects. They considered him in only one point of view, and that very superficially. They accordingly fell into the course towards which he intended to lead them. The affair of General Exelsman occurred in Paris about this time. The officer was employed in the 1st Military Division. The minister, after placing him upon half pay in consequence of a letter written by him to the King of Naples, under whom he had served as his aide-de-camp, attempted to order him away from Paris. Exelsman refused to submit to his decision and invoked the clauses of the constitutional charter. As the public mind was disaffected towards the government, everyone took part with Exelsman, and this was considered a favorable opportunity for breaking out. The Minister of War ordered the general to be arrested. The latter took to flight and demanded a council of war. He was sent before the council, sitting at Lille, to which place he repaired. The officers of the garrison went out to meet him and due ceremony conducted him to the hall where the council was held and brought him back to his house in the midst of public acclamations after the sentence of acquittal was pronounced. This decision, which was so important from its very nature, assumed a much more serious character owing to the state of the public mind. Mr. Fouché availed himself of this circumstance, and whilst commenting upon it for the purpose of exciting the passions, he caused a communication to be entered into which the generals who commanded the troops out of Paris. He immediately opened an intercourse with some of those who were stationed in the northern garrisons and soon succeeded in seducing them. He then applied himself to the National Guard. He had a ready access to them by means of Monsieur Torton, General de Saulles, besides, who commanded it, was no novice in revolutions. He had likewise succeeded in bringing over to his views General Lalemant, who commanded a brigade of dragoons in the environs of Lyon and Soissons. He had, therefore, sufficient means at his command. The only difficulty was to set the whole in motion, for it is no trifling matter to resolve upon breaking down the limits of duty for the purpose of gratuitously embarking in a criminal attempt. None were so sensible of this truth as Fouché himself. He accordingly avoided implicating his name in any proceedings and kept in reserve the means of effecting his retreat in case of need. Some street occurrences also took place, which were eagerly laid hold of and turned against the court. Mademoiselle Raucourt, the celebrated actress, died. The members of the Théâtre Français, accompanied by those of the other theaters of the capital, paid the last duties to her remains and formed a very splendid cortege. On the occasion, they brought the deceased to the church of Saint-Roch. The priest refused admittance and closed the door of his church, where he remained whilst the cortege was raising a clamor in the Rue Saint-Honoré. A crowd was soon drawn to the spot to witness the sight. They had first contented themselves with laughing at the occurrence. At last they muttered threats against the priest, who persisted in refusing admittance into his church. This state of confusion had already lasted some time when an order came from the Tuileries, where the report had been spread of what was taking place. This order directed the doors of the church of Saint-Roch to be opened and the body of the deceased to be admitted. Malevolence treasured up this fact and indulged in the most sarcastic jokes on the occasion. About the same period of time, the bodies of King Louis XVI and of Queen Marie Antoinette were disinterred and removed with much pomp on the 21st of January, 1815, from the burial ground of the Madeleine in the Rue d'Anjou to the church of Saint-Denis. The public mind was so ill-disposed that this circumstance was laid hold of as a signal for breaking out into discontent. The troops had been placed under arms at an early hour. They lined the road from the burial ground to the gate through which the cortege was to proceed on its way to Saint-Denis. The mortal remains of King Louis XVI and of Queen Marie Antoinette consisted of a handful of earth of a whitish appearance, which had been found at the place where they had been buried in quicklime. It will readily be believed that they had long ago been consumed. Nevertheless, it was asserted that the queen's cranium and even one of her garters had been found. So much the better if this was the case. These trifling remains had been placed on a funeral car of so disproportionate elevation that it was enabled to pass under the reflecting light suspended from the center of the street. This circumstance had been overlooked and no precaution had been adopted beforehand for drawing up the lights. The cortege began to move. The funeral car got entangled with lights. It was repeatedly found necessary to stop in order to remove the impediment. The weather was unfavorable. The circumstance and the neglect of the administration of public ceremonies soon had the effect of setting everyone in a good humor. The people broke out in sarcasms upon the funeral pomp, some voices even taking advantage of the moment when the ornaments of the car had got entangled with the lights, uttered the cry of "à la lanterne." It seems as if the court was purposely led into every act most calculated to afford matter for raillery. I had not yet grown to manhood when the revolution broke out, but I have heard it repeated by all those who were present at the opening of the drama that it was by means of trifles of this nature that the leading characters had succeeded in shaking the colossus, whose almost immemorial existence appeared to have secured it against the ravages of time. The greater were the errors committed by the court, the greater the anxiety to take advantage of them. All intriguers were at work. Mr. Fouché communications had grown more active, and from the beginning of February, everything portended an explosion. The different branches of the king's administration must have laid in an almost dormant state, since, according to the vulgar saying, conspiracies were hatching along the hedges at the street corners. None but the ministry were ignorant of what was going forward. Before I proceed any further, I shall offer reflection in this place. I am not writing for party purposes. I merely bring my recollections together and am not bound to secrecy towards those who not only have not confided any to me, but who have had the baseness to place my name on a list of prescription where their own names should have stood foremost, because they were the only men really implicated. I have no desire to denounce anyone, but in writing the events of the period in question, I will mention names as often as they may be connected with my narrative. If I am mistaken in quoting facts, I am ready to be corrected. But as for insults and recriminations, I must decline beforehand noticing them. I can do no harm to those who have so seriously injured me, besides which I owe them no more consideration than they have shown to myself, whether on the return from the island of Elba or on the occasion of the Emperor's last departure. I am tired of being the scapegoat of those disturbers of public tranquility, and am anxious to restore to them what they have laid to my account. They have the less danger to encounter, as their skill in the work of revolution has already protected them in the consequences they had to apprehend. Mr. Fouché considered the king's downfall as certain. His only doubt was as to the form of government which might be substituted to that of the prince. A man who has had the credit of possessing so much talent was enabled to bring two ideas together. That unsteadiness of mind and levity of character, so natural to him, had procured the name of cleverness to what was no more than a long series of duplicity. The slightest reflection will suffice to show that if Mr. Fouché had possessed any nobleness of soul and had frankly served the party which he espoused, he must have long since perished in the struggle. He only kept himself erect in the midst of the revolutionary storms by successfully betraying those to whom he had bound himself. Few persons are better able to judge him than I am, because having succeeded to his office, I have seen what he had neglected to do and what he had allowed to be done. From that period, I altered the opinion I had formed of him previously to becoming acquainted with his administration. His vacillating conduct at all times has greatly contributed to prevent the public mind from adhering to a principle which had been adopted as the basis of the public tranquility. This man, who had held during a period of 15 years the administrative situation which affords the means of estimating all others, knew not how he should act the day after effecting the king's downfall. For, in short, after destroying, it is necessary to reconstruct, and to do so with that rapidity which is alone calculated to fix the opinions of irresolute minds without allowing the adverse party any time to recover from its astonishment. He required one person to assist him in the military branch, another in the civil branch. It became necessary for him to associate colleagues to his views. He endeavored to open an intercourse with two men who would give him proofs of their experience in matters of this nature. They were both well acquainted with the personages to whom they had to deal. They both despised his versatility of character and felt the greatest aversion for him. But the law of necessity reconciles enemies, which it appears impossible to bring to a friendly understanding. The auxiliaries Fouché was desirous of acquiring listened to all he had to say without, however, committing themselves. They were possessed of too much experience to become his dupes. They required, as a preliminary measure, that Fouché should make known to them the means which he had at his command. He did so. I cannot pretend to say whether he told them what he had slightly touched upon with Metternich, but I am inclined to believe it, because an enterprise undertaken with the view of altering the government during the meeting of the Congress of Vienna would be a pure act of folly, unless some understanding had taken place with one of the great foreign powers. Mr. Fouché took care not to be silent on the subject of the objections that might have been made to him. He probably communicated his correspondence with the Duc d'Alberg and the foreign ministers. After the communication of such documents, no one could doubt that the enterprise held out a promise of a favorable result. Two colleagues whom Fouché had associated to his work were greatly attached to the emperor and capable of taking part in any plan which had not his interest in view. The Duke, who knew them well, took care to assert that he agreed in opinion with them, but that if he had uttered a single word at Vienna respecting the emperor, he would not have been listened to, and that, in short, the only means of Bringing him back was to begin by recalling his son, because it was natural to restore a father to his child. He persuaded those gentlemen that he had worked for the emperor, and I have seen them both under the impression that he had really acted in furtherance of the emperor's interests. Fouché was deceiving them, as he deceived the generals I have mentioned, with the exception of one or two in whom he discovered a character well calculated to promote conspiracies. They all imagined that they were set in motion for the emperor's advantage, but the auxiliaries so often mentioned were thoroughly acquainted with Monsieur Fouché. They only half trusted him, and bethought themselves of leading into a direction in accordance with their views all those whom he contemplated to turn in another direction. Setting to work in this way, they completely succeeded in baffling Fouché's projects.